Bakit nga ba interesado ang mga inchik sa Ayungin Shoal? Dahil ba sa likas na yamang dagat? O sa military strategic nito? Ano nga ba ang dapat gagawin ng susunod na Pangulo para ipagtanggol ang ating teritoryo? Well, tunghayan ang buong detalye. At kapag hindi pa nakapag-subscribe, subscribe na para tuloy-tuloy ang ating talakayan.
Last November 16, the Chinese Coast Guard blocked and water cannoned two Philippine vessels delivering supplies to soldiers stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre on Ayungin Shoal. The dilapidated ship was intentionally grounded on the shoal 22 years ago to serve as an outpost for the Philippine Navy and reinforce the country's sovereign rights over the area. The latest resupply mission resumed and was successful following strong protests from the Philippine side, including President Duterte himself, who told the recent ASEAN-China summit that he abhorred the incident. But after that, Beijing demanded that the Philippines remove the grounded vessel on Ayungin Shoal, claiming it was simply allowing resupply missions out of humanitarian consideration. Joining us tonight is Professor J. Batong Bakal. He is the director of the University of the Philippines' Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. Good evening, Attorney Batong Bakal, and thank you for joining us again on the program.
Good evening, Christian, and to all of our viewers, good evening.
Okay, before we talk about the Chinese demand or China's demand for the Philippines to pull out BRP Sierra Madre on Ayungin Shoal, let's first talk about why it is there and the importance of the presence of that dilapidated ship in that particular area for the Philippines.
Well, the BRP Sierra Madre is there because it was our only response to China's incursion into Mischief Reef, back in 1995, and that in itself was the first breach of faith on the part of China, because in 1992 they acceded to the ASEAN Declaration of Conduct, the original one, which was what established the principle of self-restraint on the part of the smaller claimant countries. And ASEAN allowed China, invited China, and China acceded to that declaration. But 3 years later, through a secret operation that China even now celebrates, they occupied Mischief Reef. And then, after some diplomatic back and forth, diplomatic discussions, it quieted down until 1999, when China then upgraded its original small huts on Mischief Reef and turned it into a full-blown condominium type of facility. And the Philippines, having been in a sense deceived twice, essentially, decided that it needed to have eyes on the ground, and still, it was trying to abide by the self-restraint principle that it actually was advocating since 1992. So the only way they could do that, have eyes on the ground to constantly monitor China's activities on Mischief Reef, was to establish this outpost by sending a vessel. Okay, and the vessel was sent to Ayungin Shoal, or Second Thomas Shoal. And it grounded there, and although they could not leave anymore, at least it became a piece of solid ground, so to speak, from which they can then carry out their activities of monitoring China's activities in that area. So that is the reason why the BRP Sierra Madre is there, and that's why it's still there. It is still carrying out its original mission of essentially keeping tabs on what China is doing in that area.
Okay, so what will be the implications if the Philippines removes BRP Sierra Madre, especially at this time?
Well, definitely that would have serious security implications for the Philippines, because the Ayungin Shoal is only about 100 nautical miles away from Palawan. If we were to withdraw from that area, I think there is a very high probability that China will then take over that shoal, and occupy it, possibly. The reason why Ayungin Shoal was chosen was that it had the characteristics of the reefs that China appeared to be interested in, although at the time, large reefs with enclosed lagoons, these are atolls, where ships could enter and possibly dock, or at least anchor rather, and have shelter from the sea conditions. And Ayungin Shoal is like that, no? It's similar in that sense to Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross Reef and Subi Reef. So that's why the Navy decided to put the outpost there, because not only is it close to Mischief Reef, close enough for them to be able to monitor what's going on, it's also the kind of reef that China would be interested in occupying.
Okay, so for all intents and purposes, the reef, the shoal, can it be said that is in the possession of the Philippines, and basically China legally cannot remove that, of course.
Well, you have to separate the vessel and the reef itself, no? The vessel, the Sierra Madre, is still a Philippine commissioned vessel, even though it looks so derelict. No, it has not been decommissioned, and therefore it is still in the active service. As such, it is still entitled to sovereign immunity, the rights of all warships and government vessels. No, so China cannot touch that. No, only the Philippines has the right to decide on what to do with that vessel. No? Second, Ayungin Shoal, no, is part of the Philippines continental shelf and exclusive economic zone. That is very clear because there is no island or no high tide elevation near that reef. And the South China Sea Arbitration Tribunal, in fact, ruled that it is such a low tide elevation that it cannot be subject to appropriation or claims by China. No, aside from the fact that its claims based on supposed historic rights are invalid, even if it were to change its tune, no, and try to base a territorial claim on that area, there is simply no basis to do so because there is no island or high tide elevation on the reef. No, so it can only be part of the Philippine EEZ and continental shelf, and since it is 100 nautical miles from Palawan, no, therefore it is the Philippines that has every right, no, to govern, to manage that area, which includes deciding what can be done, which includes deciding on whether or not a ship, for example, like the Sierra Madre, could be stationed on it, no, as well as decide on all activities that can be carried out that can affect the natural resources there, particularly the reef itself and the fisheries there.
So China should have no business in any way at that particular area. So what would be the best response with this latest demand by China? This is not the first time, of course, that they made this demand, right?
The best response is to simply state it outright. They have no right to make that demand of us. Absolutely no basis in law or in fact to make such a demand of us. What happens on Ayungin Shoal is entirely our decision, under our discretion.
Okay. So given the reality that China cannot touch the vessel, but in reality, how about the pressure exerted by China in that particular area, even if technically it cannot touch the vessel?
Yeah. Well, clearly that is the solution that they are pursuing. No? Since they cannot physically interfere with the vessel itself, it being entitled to sovereign immunity, and since the vessel is being used by the Philippines as an outpost, what they want to do is essentially to strangle the supply lines so that we ourselves, no, will not be able to sustain the people there, and they will then leave voluntarily. No? And once that happens, once they leave their posts because, well, as a matter of survival, no, then China definitely will move in. They will probably immediately take steps to salvage the vessel, to destroy it or carry it out of the reef. No?
So there has to be a living soul on the vessel.
Yes. No? There has to be presence on the vessel because as long as there are soldiers there, there are marine contingent is there. No, they cannot go in. No. But if that were an abandoned wreck, no, they could easily, at any time, take measures to pulverize the structure, no, so that it becomes uninhabitable, or you cannot even use it to station anyone there, no, and cart away the material as well. No?
Okay. So what happens if China, let's say, touches the vessel, let's say, attacks it or removes it forcibly?
Well, to exert force on that vessel, definitely would be considered as an act of aggression by the Philippines, I'm sure, no? That's why China is worried. That is what is stopping China, because definitely the Philippines will not react kindly to such a unilateral action on the part of China. No? Whether or not they will use armed force, no, weapons or anything of that sort, no, then that will probably merit a corresponding response on the part of the Philippines. And the thing is, since it is a commissioned vessel, the Philippines, no, could call upon its allies, no, such as the United States, to assist, no, in protecting the vessel from any intrusion or attack, no matter what kind of attack, no, in whatever form, no, from a foreign power.
So that can
It will
activate the
entitle
mutual.
to exercise self-defense.
That can also activate the mutual defense treaty.
Yes, it can activate the mutual defense treaty, because if it is considered by them as an armed attack on a Philippine public vessel, no, that could fall within the terms of the treaty. Okay, of course, whatever the response, no, whatever response will be triggered by it depends on the situation, no. This also needs to be clarified. People think that when you say triggered the MDT, that means that there will be an automatic declaration of war and World War III will start. That is not a correct assumption either, no? Because responding to any kind of incident, no, even under the MDT, must be made in accordance with the laws of armed conflict, no? And that includes standards and criteria for reasonability and proportionality of the response. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it will start a war, but definitely it will trigger a response from our allies.
Sure, you cannot just expect American fighter planes bombing Chinese positions because of that. It depends on what the Chinese would actually do.
Yes,
Okay.
they have to measure it. No, the response must be proportional and reasonable in light of the circumstances.
Okay. Now, how strategic or crucial is the Ayungin Shoal as far as China is concerned?
For China, Ayungin Shoal will result in the expansion of their area of influence and control. No, they actually have a study wherein they already cataloged all of the reefs in the South China Sea and islands, and they gave it scores in terms of importance for whatever strategic or security purposes they might have. And Ayungin Shoal, which they call Renai Reef, no, if I remember correctly, scores very high on that list of priority areas for occupation and control.
Because
Because if you look at the map, no, yung location niya, the location of Renai Reef, no, it basically will expand, no, the areas that are under the influence of their existing facilities, no. When you look at the map and the distribution of the reefs that they occupy, you have the big three military bases of Mischief, Subi, and Fiery Cross Reef forming a triangle, no? And then around this triangle, no, there are some facilities that are outside the triangle, such as Corteron Reef. Some of them are inside, okay? But if they were to capture Ayungin Shoal, what you would have would be a new facility, a new point in that scoreboard, parang a new point on that scoreboard where the triangle, no, the area under the direct influence of the triangle will move eastwards towards the Philippines, no.
Palawan,
It will
in
come
short.
closer to Palawan, basically, no. And from there, of course, they can expand whatever military influence they already have, no, using the existing facilities. They will just jump off from Ayungin Shoal.
So these are serious security implications as far as the Philippines is concerned, right?
Yes, it's very serious, because if that happens, no, then when you compare the position of the Chinese reefs with the positions of the Philippines, no, the ones that they occupy, they can actually cut off, no, Pag-asa Island, the islands further away, they can cut them off from Palawan if that
They can
happens.
provide a choke point of some sort.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Now,
that basically contributes to strangling our access and our supplies to those far-flung areas.
Okay, this latest incident involving China, the Chinese Coast Guard basically harassing our resupply vessels. They were water cannoned. Did you sense somehow that China is trying to up the ante at this particular time, or is this basically more of the same?
I would I would think that it's more of the same, because we've seen them employ these tactics before. No, they used it against Filipino fishermen on Scarborough Shoal. No, water cannons. They even rammed our fishermen there at one point. No? So similarly, they employ the same tactics against these resupply vessels. No, there are pictures circulating on social media, purportedly from one of the crewmen, where the China Coast Guard vessel is really bearing down on them, no, on a direct course to ram them, and then another picture which shows the hull of the China Coast Guard right next to them, practically within arm's reach of that crew member, no. So that kind of maneuvering, that kind of dangerous maneuvering, has already been done by them before, no. So the water cannon is probably the newer element, in the sense that they employed it against a vessel that is being run or being that is manned by the Philippine Navy, no? Or Marines. I'm not sure which branch, but most certainly there are Navy personnel there, no? And that they knew that these vessels were going to Ayungin Shoal to resupply them. So in that sense, it's the first direct interference with the operations of the Navy since 2017, when we last heard of interference with a resupply mission.
Unfortunately, no one got hurt in that last incident last November 16. But let's say in
Yes.
case, God forbids, in future instances, some of our personnel get hurt because of this harassment by China. What would be the options for the Philippines, especially since this happened within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines?
Well, since they use water cannon, it technically still falls short of the criteria of an armed attack. No, so it still does not may not trigger the MDT obligation. It still may not be sufficient to warrant a self-defense response on the part of the Navy that were on that vessel. No? So the option is basically, since they were carried out by the China Coast Guard, no, these are official organs of China, no, they are not allowed to employ such methods even on the ground of law enforcement, no, because under the law of the sea and international law, a state that carries out law enforcement at sea is still bound by the rules of international law, such as collision regulations, and ultimately the obligation to not cause an even greater danger to the safety of life and property at sea. So their act of trying to ram the Philippine vessels, no, and using the water cannon on them, which could potentially have sunk the vessels, no, that is already also a contravention of the basic standards of international law, including those for law enforcement, no. So because of this, there is actually basis for the Philippines to protest, to complain, and to demand compensation and reparations for this excessive act of supposed law enforcement, and that's even on the assumption that they were actually conducting law enforcement. No? But the Philippines, of course, will not describe it as that, no, and instead they have described it as an unprovoked and unwarranted interference, really.
Let's now go to the level of policy. We've seen how the Philippine government has been dealing with China under the outgoing Duterte administration. Of course, it's also very important for voters to understand how important the China policy of the Philippine government is as a campaign issue. But I'd like to ask this question first. How important do you think this coming presidential election is for China, given the kind of relations that it has had with the current administration?
Oh, it's very important for them because they of course would prefer continuity of the current administration's previously prone and soft approach. No, that's why they were able to get away with a lot. No, they were able to enter and push even deeper into the EEZ and continental shelf. They were able to establish this pattern of behavior in the EEZ with their maritime militia, with their law enforcement vessels and Navy vessels. They were able to normalize, so to speak, no, their presence and activities there, because our government was not raising hell about it at the time that they were just starting, no. So now it's even harder for us now to push back. So they would prefer, of course, an administration that will not push back, no? Because that will enable them to strengthen and reinforce their existing intrusion into the West Philippine Sea, no? And that will enable them also to achieve their objective of gaining de facto control and administration of this area, regardless of international law.
So how important is it for voters to really look into the position of those running for president in particular, vis-a-vis the China question? Because of course we've been hearing this even way back in 2016, the so-called quote-unquote Manchurian candidate, even if strictly speaking that is not how it meant, right? But basically a candidate that would be deemed friendly by China.
Well, we've already seen, no? The voters have already seen what we get out of being overly accommodating and friendly to China, no? Pogos, the entry of COVID, the pandemic, no? I mean, that was because we were being too friendly and accommodating. The loss of our natural resources, not only in terms of fisheries, but even natural resources on our coasts, no? The loss of control over areas of the sea, no? I mean, if the voters care about this country, no? If the voters care about the future of their children and our food security, our energy security for the long term, no? If they care that we still have a country in the future, no? Then they should not vote for this Manchurian candidate, no?
Well, mga kasangga, alam na dis. Kaya kayong mga pulpol na politiko, itigil ng pagnanakaw sa kaban ng bayan, panloloko sa taong bayan. Bagkus bigyan importansya ang pagpapalakas ng ating ekonomiya, pagpapalakas ng ating hukbong sandatahan. Namulat na kayo sa katotohanan na pag-iiwanan na tayo. Hanggang hindi nyo natututunan mahalin ang ating inang bayan at kapwa Pilipino, malulugmok tayo sa kahiyan sa ibang bansa. Well, baka naman, pwede nang mag-like, mag-share at mag-comment. Diyos siya ginahapo. Hanggang sa muli!